It all began in the quiet cul-de-sac of Maplewood, a neighborhood that could have been plucked straight out of a Hallmark Christmas movie, except for the inexplicable tension that seemed to coil around every perfectly manicured lawn. My name is Daniel Harper, and I had spent the better part of November orchestrating the grandest Christmas display in the neighborhood. I am not exaggerating when I say it was an architectural marvel of holiday cheer. Every house in Maplewood had its standard strings of multicolored lights and inflatable Santa Clauses, but my home, at 23 Elm Street, was the undisputed epicenter of Christmas spectacle. Giant LED snowflakes hung from the eaves, a life-sized reindeer herd pranced on the front lawn, and a mechanical Santa waved from the roof, synchronized to classic Christmas carols that blared proudly from strategically placed speakers. I had spent countless nights measuring, tucking, and aligning every strand of lights, ensuring that each bulb glimmered in perfect harmony with the snow-capped garden gnomes I had painstakingly acquired from auctions and obscure holiday fairs. The first hint that something was amiss arrived on a Wednesday morning when my neighbor Bob Jenkins, a man whose enthusiasm for his own modest display had always bordered on obsessive, came over under the pretense of borrowing a ladder. He stood on my porch, eyes gleaming with a mixture of admiration and, as I would soon realize, predatory calculation. "Daniel, you've really outdone yourself this year," he said, his voice syrupy and carefully measured. I nodded, unsuspecting, oblivious to the sinister undertone hidden beneath the cheer. I had learned over the years that Bob's admiration often masked a peculiar competitiveness. He had an inexplicable need to outshine anyone within a 3-block radius, a trait that made him simultaneously amusing and dangerous in the realm of neighborhood holiday politics. That evening, as dusk settled and the first flurries of snow dusted our roofs, I stepped out to admire the fruits of my labor. The sight that met me made my blood run cold. Every piece of my meticulously arranged decorations had vanished. The mechanical Santa, the reindeer, the gnomes, all gone. My driveway was a barren expanse, lit only by the soft glow of street lamps, the silence of the neighborhood mocking me with cruel precision. At first, I blamed the wind, perhaps an accident of gravity or a stray SUV scraping the edge of my lawn, but the footprints in the snow told a different story. They were large, clumsy, and unmistakably human, leading directly toward Bob's house 3 doors down. A sinking feeling settled over me, one that combined disbelief, fury, and the sharp sting of personal violation. My holiday sanctuary had been infiltrated, plundered, and claimed as someone else's. The betrayal was palpable, a knife twisting in the heart of my seasonal joy. I spent the rest of the night reviewing the footage from my security cameras, which Bob had been blissfully unaware I had installed. There he was, illuminated by the cold, stark light of the driveway motion sensors, moving like a thief in a caricature of a heist movie. Each reindeer was lifted with comically exaggerated care, each gnome tucked into the back of his pickup truck, with the precision of someone who had clearly rehearsed this theft. I remember muttering to myself in disbelief, "Neighbor revenge is going to be delicious." The phrase was instinctive, a vow that simmered beneath my skin like a secret fire. My mind, previously a repository for joy and festive planning, began to churn with plots and counterplots, schemes that were part strategy, part absurdist fantasy, and wholly satisfying to contemplate. By morning, the entire cul-de-sac was abuzz with gossip. Bob's house was now a shrine to my creativity. Multicolored lights danced across his lawn in patterns I had designed, and the neighborhood children pointed and laughed with awe, oblivious to the moral transgression. Bob himself stood on his porch, striking poses like a holiday demigod, occasionally offering me a sheepish wave that I ignored with deliberate disdain. The audacity was breathtaking, the theatricality bordering on absurd. He had not only taken my decorations, but had also curated them into a display designed to mock the very idea of originality. Every instinct within me screamed for immediate confrontation, yet I recognized that true neighbor revenge required patience, creativity, and above all, subtlety. I spent the following days meticulously cataloging every detail of my stolen decorations. I took photographs, noting the scratches, dents, and the small imperfections that would later prove useful in my campaign of absurdist justice. Each observation added a layer to the narrative I was constructing in my mind, a story that transformed a simple theft into a parable of cosmic irony. The idea was no longer simply to reclaim my property, but to orchestrate a spectacle in which Bob, the self-proclaimed holiday virtuoso, would be confronted with the consequences of his hubris in the most public, humiliating, and hilariously ironic manner imaginable. This was not merely neighbor revenge, this was art. The next week, I became an unwilling spectator to the most bizarre evolution of Bob's personality I had ever witnessed. Overnight, his display took on the characteristics of a parody of the entire Maplewood neighborhood. He had not merely adopted my decorations, he had integrated them into a sprawling, grotesquely magnificent fantasy landscape. Inflatable penguins wearing Santa hats marched alongside LED-lit polar bears, artificial snow machines created a constant flurry over his lawn, and a mechanical elf orchestra played a cacophonous medley of carols that could be heard 3 blocks away. The entire neighborhood had begun to treat his property as a tourist attraction. I watched through my kitchen window, coffee in hand, as local families drove by in SUVs, taking pictures and applauding Bob as if he were a celebrity. It was surreal, almost hallucinatory, a real-life parody of a Christmas movie turned twisted comedy. The psychological effect on me was profound. I felt like a character in a conspiracy theory, a man whose identity and creative labor had been co-opted for the amusement of the masses. The absurdity of it all was nearly comical. I found myself concocting increasingly elaborate fantasies in which I was not merely reclaiming my decorations, but exposing Bob as a villain in an epic saga of holiday deceit. I envisioned neighborhood children discovering the hidden truth, the mayor issuing a proclamation denouncing the theft, and Bob's house collapsing under the weight of its own garish excess, all while my original decorations were restored to their rightful place. These were obviously extreme imaginings, yet they provided a cathartic release, a mental rehearsal of the neighbor revenge that I knew was forthcoming. By the following weekend, I began implementing small interventions. A strategically placed speaker emitted faint, dissonant carol notes that clashed with Bob's mechanical orchestra. A cleverly rigged snow machine sprayed a tiny plume directly onto his driveway at intervals that would guarantee comedic disruption. I began leaving anonymous notes in his mailbox, written in ornate calligraphy. Your display is impressive, but originality has its limits. These minor acts of sabotage were both experimental and performative, serving as rehearsal for the larger campaign of neighbor revenge that I was planning. Each intervention was calibrated to maximize irony, humiliation, and narrative satisfaction. It was during this period that I realized I could escalate the absurdity by recruiting allies. My neighbors, previously passive spectators, became unwitting accomplices in my plot. I encouraged subtle interventions, framing them as enhancements to Bob's display rather than acts of sabotage. A neighbor's daughter planted a line of candy cane stakes that subtly directed foot traffic away from Bob's yard. Another neighbor, an elderly man named Mr. Whitman, began timing his dog walks to coincide with the moment the mechanical elf orchestra played its loudest notes, adding an additional layer of auditory chaos. The interplay between deliberate action and chaotic spontaneity created a surreal tableau in which Bob Jenkins, the self-appointed king of Christmas, was gradually ensnared in a narrative of his own making, the pinnacle of neighbor revenge taking form in real time. As the absurd empire of Bob Jenkins expanded, I maintained the appearance of normalcy. I would greet him politely at the mailbox, nodding as if I admired his work, while my mind spun intricate plots for escalation. I had become both spectator and director, crafting a living parody in which every action, reaction, and misstep contributed to the final act. The tension reached a fever pitch one evening when I observed Bob attempting to rearrange my original reindeer into an unauthorized pattern. The mechanical movements of the reindeer triggered a hidden mechanism I had installed, a small, harmless device that caused a flurry of confetti to erupt over his head. The children screamed with delight, the neighbors applauded, and Bob stood in a shower of paper, momentarily defeated. It was the first public victory in what I intended to be a long and intricate campaign of neighbor revenge. The morning after the confetti incident, Maplewood awoke to an unusual quiet. Snow had fallen overnight, blanketing the neighborhood in a pristine layer of white, but something felt off. It was as if the universe itself was pausing to observe the next act in our unfolding drama of neighbor revenge. I, Daniel Harper, had spent the previous weeks meticulously plotting every subtle disruption, yet I knew that to truly reclaim my holiday glory, I needed something more elaborate. A grand gesture that would not only expose Bob Jenkins for the audacious thief he was, but also entertain, bemuse, and mildly terrify the entire cul-de-sac. I started with reconnaissance. Every morning, I would position myself at the kitchen window with binoculars and a thermos of black coffee, documenting Bob's routines. The man had become predictably predictable, a caricature of obsessive holiday enthusiasm. He would step outside promptly at 8 a.m., check the alignment of his LED snowflakes, adjust his mechanical elves choreography, and, without fail, wave to anyone who glanced his way. It was almost like watching a bizarre ecosystem in which the apex predator was an over-decorated suburban man, and I, his prey-turned-master tactician, would manipulate every variable. My plan required precise timing and the coalescence of several neighborhood actors, each unwittingly participating in the grand comedy of neighbor revenge. The first stage of my escalation involved integrating absurdist fantasy elements into Bob's carefully curated display. Late one night, armed with a truckload of inflatable extraterrestrial figurines and battery-powered fog machines, I quietly arranged a crop of neon green aliens marching through his yard. Each alien was positioned in an aggressive, upright stance, some clutching tiny replica snowballs, others appearing to beckon the neighborhood children toward an invisible portal in his driveway. As I worked, I imagined Bob's reaction in exquisite detail, his horror, his confusion, the slow realization that his meticulously orchestrated holiday empire had been infiltrated by creatures no sane person would expect to encounter outside of a science fiction convention. The aliens were complemented by fog, drifting in low waves across the lawn, giving the impression that Bob's property had become a landing zone for intergalactic visitors. This was not merely vandalism, it was a performance. A masterclass in subtle humiliation. The children would adore it, the neighbors would gossip, and Bob would be left to explain why his Christmas spectacle now included extraterrestrial invaders. The strategic element of neighbor revenge required patience. Each alien placement was carefully mapped, ensuring that when the morning sun hit the fog and LED lights, shadows would stretch eerily across his driveway, enhancing the illusion that his yard was under siege. I even added a few life-sized penguin figurines dressed as astronauts, a playful nod to my sense of humor and a reminder that in Maplewood, creativity was my true weapon. The next phase involved psychological manipulation. I began leaving anonymous, cryptic notes around Bob's property, messages written in dramatic, Gothic-style lettering on red cardstock. "The past always returns," one read, left perched on a snowman. "The universe notices everything," another was pinned to the mechanical Santa. These messages were nonsensical enough to bewilder him, yet precise enough to induce paranoia. Every morning I would watch as Bob approached the notes with exaggerated caution, scanning the yard for hidden cameras or secret accomplices, muttering to himself in that peculiarly American combination of self-importance and defensiveness. His behavior became more erratic with each passing day, a slow unraveling of composure that I had orchestrated from the safety of my own festively lit home. To escalate further, I involved the neighborhood children in subtle ways. Not directly, of course, they were unwitting participants, but through suggestion and placement of props, I created scenarios that amplified the absurdity. A strategically positioned line of candy canes, leading directly to the aliens, gave the impression that extraterrestrial visitors were leaving treats for the locals. A small fog machine tucked behind his reindeer herd emitted intermittent clouds, timed to coincide with the mechanical Santa's wave. The effect was uncanny. Bob would activate one of his motion sensor decorations, only to be enveloped in fog and startled by the glow of neon green aliens, all while the neighborhood children giggled from behind fences and cars. The entire cul-de-sac became an unwitting stage for my neighbor revenge, a reality show with no cameras, only genuine confusion and escalating absurdity. By midweek, I had expanded the operation into full-scale parody. Bob's previously impressive display now resembled a chaotic winter carnival gone wrong. Inflatable aliens tangled with reindeer, LED lights blinked in conflicting patterns due to my subtle interference with his timers, and the mechanical Santa had been accidentally rewired to play a minor key version of Jingle Bells, producing a sound both mournful and hilarious. Bob's public demeanor began to shift from pride to agitation. He tried to explain the strange occurrences to neighbors, only to be met with polite confusion and suppressed laughter. It was a tableau of suburban humiliation, perfectly executed, and entirely within the ethical bounds of creative neighbor revenge. The pinnacle of this phase occurred on Saturday evening. I orchestrated a full-scale intervention, enlisting the help of Mrs. Whitman, a retired drama teacher with a flair for theatrics. She stood on her porch, dressed as a mischievous elf, loudly proclaiming that the aliens were seeking justice for the stolen decorations, pointing theatrically at Bob's yard. Neighbors gathered, children squealed in delight, and Bob, standing amidst his fog-drenched, neon-lit chaos, looked increasingly bewildered. I remained in my house, invisible but omniscient, savoring every moment of his escalating frustration. The absurdity reached its zenith when the mechanical elves, perhaps sensing the energy, began to malfunction spectacularly, spinning in erratic patterns while emitting squeaky, distorted carol notes. The neighborhood erupted in laughter. Bob's empire of stolen holiday glory had transformed into a theater of parody, a living testament to the subtle power of neighbor revenge executed with patience, creativity, and a hint of theatrical absurdity. Even in this moment of peak chaos, I could see the seeds of a larger narrative emerging. I envisioned future years in which my Christmas displays would return, more elaborate than ever, and Bob would be remembered not as the king of Maplewood holidays, but as the man whose audacious theft of decorations led to a series of absurd, unforgettable events. Neighbor revenge, I realized, was not merely about reclaiming what was stolen. It was about narrative control, performance art, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing justice delivered, with intelligence, humor, and meticulous planning. By the end of the week, Maplewood had become a neighborhood theater, Bob's yard the stage, and I, Daniel Harper, the invisible director of a holiday epic. Each alien, fog cloud, and cryptic note served a dual purpose: to amuse and to punish, to entertain, and to subtly reclaim authority over my stolen creations. The psychological and performative dimensions of neighbor revenge had reached a level of sophistication I had never imagined, transforming a simple act of theft into a narrative spectacle that would be remembered for years to come. The following Sunday dawned with an unusual calm in Maplewood. The snow had compacted into icy sheets along the sidewalks, shimmering under the weak winter sun, and the air carried that peculiar crispness unique to Midwestern mornings. I, Daniel Harper, surveyed the neighborhood from my front porch, sipping hot cocoa with a hint of peppermint, my binoculars resting beside me like the tools of a general inspecting a battlefield. My yard remained untouched, yet it radiated victory. Across the street, Bob Jenkins stood in the center of his yard, tangled in fog, neon green aliens leaning perilously, his mechanical elves shrieking in minor keys, and his previously proud snowman now wearing a tinfoil crown lopsidedly on his head. I knew, with a grim satisfaction only achievable through patient, theatrical neighbor revenge, that the final act was about to unfold. Bob's first move came in the form of a passive-aggressive complaint to the Homeowners Association, a tedious ritual that involved emails drafted with careful fury and demands for immediate restoration of holiday order. I read them with amusement, sharing selected excerpts with Mrs. Whitman over coffee. She, wearing a knitted elf hat, commented, "Daniel, you are turning suburban chaos into art." I smiled, imagining my narrative control over Maplewood. Bob, the once proud thief, now a reluctant actor in my improvised holiday play. To escalate toward the climax, I employed an ally no one suspected, the postal carrier, Mr. Rodriguez. Known for his deadpan delivery and strict adherence to rules, he agreed, after a brief negotiation over a homemade gingerbread cookie, to become an unintentional accomplice in my neighbor revenge. Packages arrived daily at Bob's porch, nothing illegal, merely elaborate props. Inflatable snow dragons, life-sized cardboard penguins with exaggerated frowns, and strategically placed blinking lights designed to interfere with his timers. Each delivery was labeled "From the North Pole Division of Extraterrestrial Affairs," a small nod to the absurdist parody I had been orchestrating. Bob's confusion escalated. He approached each package with caution, shaking his head and muttering, "This has to be some kind of cosmic joke." The neighborhood children, watching from a distance, began to speculate that aliens had truly landed in Maplewood, leaving Bob as their bewildered liaison. The psychological tension reached its zenith when I orchestrated a grand confrontation. I had invited neighbors under the guise of a community holiday review, ostensibly to admire Christmas displays. In reality, it was a stage for exposing Bob's audacious theft and my own creative genius in neighbor revenge. As the crowd gathered, I remained hidden, controlling the chaos through prearranged timers, fog machines, and cleverly wired speakers playing distorted carols. The moment Bob stepped outside to boast, the fog thickened, aliens seemed to animate, and the mechanical elves erupted into a cacophony of squeaks and clangs. Gasps and laughter erupted from the onlookers. Bob, mid-sentence, froze, realization dawning in slow motion that his empire of stolen decorations had become a public spectacle, a living parody of his former pride. I emerged, finally stepping onto my own yard, which glowed warmly in comparison to the chaos across the street. "Bob," I called, voice carrying across the snow-covered cul-de-sac, "I think you'll find that Maplewood appreciates creativity over theft." My tone was calm, almost pastoral, a deliberate contrast to the absurdity surrounding him. The crowd cheered, children laughed, and even Mrs. Whitman gave me a dramatic curtsy, reinforcing the theatricality of neighbor revenge executed to perfection. Bob, red-faced and flustered, muttered incoherently, his earlier bravado evaporating like fog in the morning sun. But the climax was not merely public humiliation. I wanted closure, a resolution that would resonate beyond the absurdity, a moral anchored in the subtle ethics of Maplewood. I approached Bob cautiously, holding a freshly baked pie, a gesture of both mockery and reconciliation. "I brought you something," I said, offering the pie as if it were a peace treaty. He looked at me suspiciously, then hesitantly accepted, muttering, "I suppose this is neighborly." In that moment, the tension dissolved. The neighborhood had witnessed the power of creative justice, the spectacle of neighbor revenge, and the quiet wisdom that sometimes the most effective retribution comes wrapped in humor, artistry, and subtle psychological manipulation. The aftermath was even more surreal. Bob, perhaps out of embarrassment or newfound humility, began to participate in decorating Maplewood collaboratively. The aliens remained as a permanent fixture, the fog machines were carefully timed for entertainment purposes, and the mechanical elves, having survived their initial rebellion, now performed reliably, their squeaky notes a testament to human ingenuity and perseverance. I, Daniel Harper, had reclaimed my Christmas decorations, elevated my own creative standing, and transformed what began as theft into a narrative of absurd, memorable neighbor revenge. Maplewood, once a standard suburban tableau, had become a theater of the unexpected, a place where boundaries between reality and parody blurred, and everyone, thief and victim alike, found themselves actors in a story they would retell for years. As the sun set over snow-dusted roofs, I reflected on the intricate choreography of human behavior. Neighbor revenge, I realized, was more than retaliation. It was a performance art, a demonstration of strategic foresight, and an ethical exercise in creative justice. Maplewood would never forget the winter of the neon green aliens, fogged driveways, and cryptic notes. And Bob Jenkins, for all his flaws, had learned that audacious theft could meet audacious retribution, delivered not with malice, but with style, humor, and the careful precision of someone who understood the subtle power of narrative. By the time the streetlights flickered on, illuminating snowflakes in mid-air, I knew the story had reached its perfect paradoxical balance. Chaos tamed, justice served, and neighbor revenge immortalized. Maplewood returned to its sleepy picturesque rhythm, but the memory of that winter, of aliens marching through yards, elves shrieking in defiance, and a once proud man humbled by absurdist justice, would linger in every conversation, every glance over snow-covered fences, a reminder that creativity, patience, and a touch of American ingenuity could transform the simplest conflict into legend.